Well, the indictment is out when it comes to President of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro. So, Kelly and I are here to break it down because we've read it. I don't know about you, Kelly. I got questions. But hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the Resident Legal Diva, and I'm here with the amazing Kelly Hyman, and we're here as part of Legal AF. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to make sure you get all the deets at the intersection of law and politics. So, the indictment is out. It was long. Again, I got my thoughts. Kelly, I'll let you lead off because I may be biased, but I was like, what is this? But
I would love to hear your thoughts. You always have great insight.
Oh, no, you're pitching it back to me? Okay, fine. So first off, not to be a little shady. So to be clear, former prosecutor, have read, written, dealt with indictments over a very long course of my career. That was really badly written. Like, when I see the line, and let me quote exactly, as a member of Venezuela's National Assembly, Maduro Moros, was referring to President Maduro, moved loads of cocaine under the protection of Venezuelan law enforcement. Loads? Like, usually you are specific, right? Over the course of 20 years, Maduro's Moros moved 500 kilos, 1,000 kilos. Like you speak with specificity, not like, oh, he did like a lot of really bad stuff, so that's why we're indicting him. So to me, that kind of, we saw this a little bit with the Letitia James case and how Lindsay Halligan, like when her indictment was a hot mess, right? So to me, that's kind of telling me the level of prosecutor that's handling this. And I'm very curious to know what was even presented to the grand jury, because there's a lot of storytelling, but I'm not seeing a whole lot of evidence. But again, Kelly, please feel free to disagree.
So let's take a step back and talk about the grand jury. So what happens is the prosecution get up in front of the grand jury and they present the case. And based on what is presented by the grand jury, do they believe that, in fact, there was a serious crime and someone should be indicted? Here, based on the prosecution's argument to the grand jury, they believe that, in fact, he should be indicted. Now, it's also important to remember that prosecutors usually, when they bring a case, they want to make sure that they have their ducks in a row. And what does that mean? They go to your point. Do they have sufficient evidence to prove their case? Since the prosecution brings a case, they in fact have to prove every single element of the charges. So we're going to have to see what happens, how this plays out in court, of whether or not they're found guilty or not guilty.
Yeah. And one thing to definitely note, that this is going to be brought in the great state of New York, my home state, right? So New York juries are nothing to play with. Like, if you don't have every single thing in a row, they will turn around, give you the fastest not guilty you have ever seen, and boot you on out the door. So I don't know if they thought by filing charges there, they were going to, Kelly, what do you think the strategy was in picking New York? Because I'm not really, again, from reading the indictment, I don't see the nexus to New York State specifically. So what are your thoughts on that?
That's a really interesting point. So when you bring these cases and talk about like jurisdiction, does in fact the jurisdiction can have the ability for someone to appear in front of them and to hear. Usually when you have these type of cases, the person is a resident of that state, or they have some kind of property in that state that kind of ties them, as they say, like a nexus, a link between the person and, in fact, the indictment. And so you bring up a really interesting point of what ties into New York, of what is the reasoning behind, in fact, that should be the place where this indictment was brought.
And if you're thinking from a strategic perspective, he would have been smarter to have it brought in the Southern District of Florida. Because again, when you think about the population of the state of Florida, First of all, there's a huge Venezuelan population. I mean, they call Doral, which is a community not too far from where I live, they call it Doralzuela, basically because of the huge Venezuelan population that lives there. So, if you're trying to swing the odds, I would think you'd want to file it in Florida, but by filing it in New York, you're almost guaranteeing, to me, based on what the indictment says now. Now, we all know the prosecution does not need to lay out every single fact they have in the indictment. It's basically a preview, a coming attractions of and a amuse-bouche of what's to come, right? But based on what I'm seeing here, I mean, there's a lot of listing of, there's the Zetas, there's FARC, there's like naming off all of these different gangs. And again, I'm like, how are you going to prove that there was a conspiracy to work with these people, right? Now, he could be, and let's be very clear, I'm going to keep saying this over and over again. I am not a Maduro fan. I am not here to defend anything that he does, what he's done to his people, anything like that. But I am a huge defender of due process. And I am a huge defender of not prosecuting people if you don't have the evidence. So just because all of these gangs exist and operate in Colombia and Argentina and Venezuela doesn't necessarily mean he was co-signing what was going on or actively a part of it. And by that same argument, which is what's scary to me, and Kelly, you tell me your thoughts on this, by talking about FARC and all these other different gangs, you're now bringing, like the Sinaloa cartel, you're bringing Mexico and Colombia into the frame. And he's already made threats that Mexico and Colombia need to get themselves in order. Colombia is run by a very sick, bad man. So what's next? We just gonna run around snatching up presidents of countries and hauling them in and saying that they're all drug traffickers? Like where is this going, Kelly? Tell me your thoughts.
Well, and you were a former prosecutor. When a prosecutor brings a case, they have to make sure that they can prove their case because they bring it, but then also sustain the case on appeal because they have certain obligations to do that. And so I think that's really important when you look at these legal cases, that in fact there needs to be a basis and the elements. Now, the indictment is very long and there are serious allegations. And if in fact he is convicted of those charges, that he could potentially spend the rest of his life in jail. But it's also, let's look at the monetary stuff as well, as there's a section in the indictment that in fact is the money illegally gained is not something you would be able to keep. So if the allegations are true, in fact, that all this money and because of it, then the government makes an argument that no, that money, you are not entitled to that money because of your wrongdoing in this situation.
And that's interesting you bring that up, Kelly, because there's a whole clause where they talk about forfeiture. So what, folks may not be familiar with this, but basically if you are convicted of, let's say, in this instance, drug trafficking, right? Like you think of Ray from around the way who gets arrested for drug trafficking, they go to prison, right? So that means they can snatch his bank account. They can snatch any weapons that he may have used allegedly in the commission of the crime. They could take property that may be in his name, right? So it's the same kind of mentality that we're looking at now in terms of Maduro, but how far does this go? Like, can they somehow say, oh, well, that oil field over there, Maduro claimed ownership over it because of whatever, therefore we get to seize it, right? Like, how far could this potentially go? Because it doesn't specify, it's a very broad catch-all, like any properties or anything that is owned by Maduro and may have been gotten through the commission of these crimes, that's not a whole lot of guardrails. Or is it me?
It's potentially could be, anything which in fact, now this is after he in fact is proven guilty, and you are innocent in the court of law until you are proven guilty. That is how our system works. But it could potentially be anything where in fact he's the owner of, or some kind of benefit, or sky's the limit, so to speak. It's if there's some kind of link between him and these alleged ill-gotten gains.
Yeah, so that's the devil's always in the details. But before we wrap up, we got to make sure folks know what he's charged with. So there are 4 counts on the indictment. That includes narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, possession of machine guns and destructive devices, and conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices, which again is kind of interesting from the perspective of, I mean, I know Second Amendment doesn't necessarily apply, but at the same token, how are you going to prove this was the machine gun used by, and Maduro wasn't out here with machine guns either. So all of this is sus. But what the government needs to prove is that Nicolás Maduro, President Nicolás Maduro, and his co-defendants, including his wife, which the only thing they really mentioned about his wife is that she was present for a meeting where bribes happened and that she was president of the National Assembly, which is basically like their Congress. But I'm not seeing much more. Again, coming attractions, we'll see. But the government needs to prove that Nicolás Maduro and all the other folks charged with him have intentionally and knowingly combined, conspired, confederated, and agreed together and with each other. That's going to be tough unless you got some audio, you got somebody who's sitting in the room who's going to, flip, snitch, something. And then for the firearms charge, knowingly possessed firearms, aided and abetted in the use, carrying, and possession of firearms, to wit, machine guns that were capable of automatically shooting more than one shot without manually reloading, la la la. And, and basically that there was a conspiracy to use weapons. So again, Kelly, final words, because there's a lot here.
So when you talk about conspiracy, it's essentially a meeting of the minds of 2 people that come together to do something, and there needs to be some kind of act for that conspiracy, and that both people, whoever's involved in the conspiracy, need to know exactly what that is. So to your point, it'll be interesting to see, maybe there's a whistleblower, so to speak, of someone that's on the inner circle that can help substantiate this case. We're going to have to wait and see what happens and who potentially that person is going to be. What do you think? Who do you think it is?
I'm thinking it's somebody who, yes, is gang affiliated, is involved in narco terrorism on some way, shape, or form, but is going to say whatever they need to say to get out from whatever charges they may be facing, or they may have been promised a reduced prison sentence. You never know. So I'm going to curious to see the credibility of the person that they end up bringing forward. Because again, I don't really see a pathway to proving this without witnesses. And definitely, in order for you to be a witness to this kind of level of conspiracy, you had to be in the room. Like, because anything else would be hearsay, an out of court statement that wouldn't be admissible. Like, well, I heard on the street that so-and-so and so-and-so were in league to try to do XYZ. That doesn't cut it. You need someone who is like, I was in the room, Maduro handed so-and-so an envelope of $500,000 with the instructions to do, get these drugs from point A to point B. If you don't have that, if you don't have a wiretap or something, I don't see where this is going. But coming attractions is what an indictment is, so we will see. So, with that being said, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the resident legal diva. That's the amazing Kelly Hyman. And thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon.